Hello, welcome to the Books Applied podcast presented by WSL Leadership Coaching. In this podcast, I take a look at an interesting book and give you some ideas about how it can apply to your work, sport, or life. I'm Iggy Perillo, and today's book is The Dichotomy of Leadership by Jocko, Wilinik, and Leif, Babin. These names might sound familiar to you from Extreme Ownership, another podcast episode I did a little while back, and this is kind of the sequel book to that. To review, in Extreme Ownership, they give you 4 principles to deal with leadership and the problem and process of ownership. Your principles are, number 1, cover and move, which equals teamwork and not having silos. Number 2, principle is simplicity, because complexity breeds chaos, but also the commands and leadership and organization needs to be simple enough that everyone recognizes the commander's intent. Number 3 is prioritize and execute. And this is where leaders detach from the details to assess the highest priority things and communicate that to the team and ensure that everyone executes. And principle number 4 is decentralized command, which means everyone leads. This means that everyone has to understand what and why they do things, and it requires a lot of communication and trust. So all of those sort of leadership principles together boil down to extreme ownership in some ways, where a leader takes ownership of mistakes, determines what went wrong, and they also develop solutions to fix or prevent more mistakes from happening. In the dichotomy of leadership, the authors sort of look at what some of the critiques were from extreme ownership and then develop a little more nuanced and broader explanation of how they see leadership. One of the criticisms they got was like, well, extreme ownership, I need to get everyone in everyone's grill all the time and make everything happen, which was not what they meant. And they addressed that a little bit, among other sort of misconceptions of the idea. You can start by reading Extreme Ownership and then move on to the Dichotomy of Leadership, but I didn't find that to be super necessary. The Dichotomy of Leadership as itself is a pretty solid standalone book that can give you some good information about leadership that doesn't really involve nearly as many stories about machine gunning sheep, unlike Extreme Ownership did. The Dichotomy of Leadership gets into some of the tensions around being a leader and how too much of one side is no good, but too little of the same thing could be no good. So they break it down into many chapters and talk about sort of the pluses and minuses of each topic. The book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is balancing people. And the 4 chapters in this part, the headings of them, go into the ultimate dichotomy they call about, which is balancing the care of troops and completing the mission. So basically taking care of the people, but also getting things done. The second part is about owning it all, but empowering others. So how to be, and I think this gets more to the contradictions people saw or the extremes that people got wrapped up in when they talked about the extreme ownership. How you can be responsible for everything, but also empower other people to do what they need to do to get things done. The next part is being resolute but not overbearing. So really some useful tips around how to be firm, but not too much. So you can see that there's obviously, if you're not firm enough, people maybe walk over you, you don't get things done. But if you're too overbearing, no one likes working with you. And that can also slow down productivity, blah, 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 that kind of thing. And then the 4th part has a great title, When to Mentor and When to Fire. Like sometimes you got to fire people. Not everyone is necessarily coachable. Not everyone will necessarily get on board with your mission. Not everyone will necessarily be someone that you want to have as part of your team. But there's a fine line. Like most folks you need to mentor or can educate or can train, and they'll do great. Some folks, maybe not so much. Then they got to get fired. And part of being a good leader is making that decision. At one point they say, most underperformers don't need to be fired, they need to be led. So before firing people, they also circle back to looking into what are you doing to lead these folks that make you think that they're underperforming? Or what have you done that hasn't supported them in their development or to be good performers on your team? The next part of the book is balancing the mission. So kind of how to get things done in various ways. And they talk about, within this section, training hard, but training smart. And this involves some realism, some fundamentals, and some repetition. So really kind of lessons on how to be a good trainer or teacher for folks. The next part is being aggressive, but not reckless. And he kind of dials back some of the stories he told about the things that sound pretty extreme, being a Navy SEAL, when in reality they're really involved in a process and being aggressive about things, but not reckless about things. And there's a pretty understandable dichotomy between recklessness and aggressiveness that they go into more explanation of, which is pretty interesting. Next up is being disciplined but not rigid, being able to hold a line, but also being able to adapt when needed. The balance between flexibility and rigidity is pretty important to get things done and to adapt and move as things change around you. The next part of this section is holding people accountable, but don't hold their hands, which can sound a little maybe patronizing perhaps, but understanding why and being able to hold yourself accountable is an important part of this. And then understanding like why you need to be accountable to yourself, but also why the folks around you need to be accountable also. Part of your plan is to help them understand this so you don't have to hold their hand and lead them through everything, that they can take on that sort of individual leadership and dispersed leadership for getting things done. This is important so folks can take on that part of leading themselves and the dispersed leadership that's necessary so other folks can make decisions within the project or the goal to get things done. The last main part of the book is called Balancing Yourself. And that's really about how you as a leader present yourself and interact within the world versus what you're doing. Sort of the other chapters focus on the people and the mission more. So this one's about you as a leader yourself. And these sections include being a leader and a follower. So making sure that as a leader, you know that your job is to follow orders and support the chain of command, but also that you need to make decisions at the same time. And so there's a little bit of tension between those two. Next, they have plan, but don't overplan. So finding that balance between how much detail you need to get into and when to step back and just be sharing more vision and letting the details handle themselves, which means making sure that your direction is clear enough and simple enough so that people can recognize the intent, but also take on ownership for themselves. The next one is being humble, but not passive. So how humility really plays a part in terms of being a really effective leader, which in some of this means being focused on growth and learning and not being passively willing to accept when things don't go your way or when then things don't go right or when failure happens. That's still another opportunity. So being humble and approaching that with humility is important, but also not being passive about those experiences and writing them off or assigning them as blame to others or making excuses for these things. And the last section is being focused but detached. So how to maintain focus within yourself as a leader, but detached enough from the outcomes and what other folks are doing in order to keep moving toward your goals and toward your objectives despite the things happening around you. One of the other sort of subsections mentioned within the book are the 3 parts of a good relationship within any or all bosses. 1 is that they trust you. 2 is that they value and seek your opinion and guidance. And 3 is that they give you what you need to accomplish your mission and then let you go execute it. So being a good leader means doing those things to build those relationships for the people within your organization, within your team. Let's switch gears a little bit to how to apply these principles and these ideas in your actual situation in your life or your sport or your work. I've found this book and its ideas to be super beneficial when working with folks who tend to gravitate toward one of these extremes within these dichotomies. They might be too focused on one piece of the extreme, like they might be too overbearing but not resolute enough, which is kind of interesting. And so some of them seem like a good thing, then it gets out of control and gets to be a bad thing. The book actually does a good job of giving examples from people in the business world who are wrestling with some of these extremes within the situation and within the other dichotomies that they mention. I really found it useful to talk with leaders about how they need to own it all, but also to empower others at the same time. That dichotomy, I think, is a struggle for folks at times who really want to either give their vision out there or they want to step back so far that they let the people around them sort of flounder a little bit and not really know what they need to be doing. The part about being humble but not passive also calls to mind the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, which maybe you've seen or heard about in a previous podcast in this series, where that focus on learning and approaching failure as an opportunity for learning and growth and challenges as an opportunity for all of that switches that humility to basically keeps that humility from being a passive response to things when they go awry or even when things go well, to not get too ego attached to some things. I was talking with some folks recently who had a very problematic teammate that they were trying to deal with. The personality of the teammate wasn't really meshing with the leadership or with the goals of the team in some way. And they were at the point of trying to decide whether they should kick this person off their team, essentially fire them. My question for that leader was, what have you done to mentor them or to train them or to help them fit in? And the leader was telling me about how they set expectations and they set guidelines and the person missed them or didn't get that done or made mistakes or did things that weren't within the guidelines they asked, which was different, I think, than offering teaching or mentoring. So I asked them again about how they were teaching or mentoring this person to fit within their team. And that opened up a much more interesting and rich conversation around what is teaching and mentoring and what is hand-holding a little bit, or what is doing things for people, and how you can also at the same time set really clear, basically boundaries around what is acceptable in terms of getting work done, behavior, communication, things like that within the team, within the organization, to make everyone else feel comfortable and safe as part of it, but also to keep everyone on the same page moving forward toward their greater objectives as a team and as an organization. What came out of that conversation was how this leader was really struggling with how to support this person. Like, they didn't know how to be a good mentor for them because they were so different from the leader. This person seemed sort of like the black sheep of the organization and of the team, and they didn't really quite understand how this person functioned the way they did or why they did. But they recognized that there was a lot of potential in this person. They just were getting burnt out trying to support. And to them, it felt like they had to deal with this person all the time in a way that was not really what they wanted to spend their time and energy doing. I've heard similar versions of this type of struggle from different leaders in different places. And it's pretty common, I think. How do you mentor someone, and when do you actually fire them or get rid of them? And some people err on the other side. They just want to keep mentoring, keep training, keep mentoring, give more chances. And everyone else around them feels like though nothing is moving in the right direction. Like they can't get anything else done. The other teammates feel neglected sometimes. Where is that balance? It's tough to find. And my main question for the leader I was talking about was like how comfortable they feel mentoring the person. They could identify the problems and struggles that this person was having and also the sort of the result of these struggles and how they impacted the team. But they didn't really know how to address the person directly and personally. And maybe they're not a therapist, they're not a counselor, they weren't someone who was trained in, the psychology of manipulating people is what they said, but that's not really what they meant. They didn't want to feel like they were manipulating this person though. But they did think that there was potential for them to get on board and be a supportive part of the team. And in the end, our conversation wound around to like, what resources did they actually need to feel like they could engage with this person in a way that helped them be productive? Was it around communication for that leader? Was it around how to offer tools that could help this person? Or was it really around like setting boundaries that were reasonable, or setting expectations, or building the confidence of this person who felt like everyone was against them, perhaps within the team or within the organization? And some of it might even boil down to another conversation with this person about what they actually wanted from that team, from that group, and from that organization, and how those expectations may just not align. If the person wanted one thing and the team and the organization wanted something else from everyone on the team, maybe it wasn't a good fit, and maybe that would be a conversation to open up. But it was probably worthwhile to explore that more specifically first, around expectations, around outcomes, around goals. The leader walked away from that conversation feeling like, one, that they needed a little more education on how to work with this person or how to engage with them. And two, feeling like they actually had a plan for what expectations to set up, what structures to set up to support this person that they knew that they could do without also getting more education. And basically the plan to have this conversation around expectations in a broader sense. And also to know that what their actual bottom line was. Was there a bottom line where if things aren't working, we actually need to separate and part ways? Just having that level of clarity was so calming to this leader who was really wrought about this situation. So being able to detach a little bit and look back at the whole situation from the perspective of mentoring and when to fire, but also what parts they needed to own and when they needed to empower others in order to do their part, in order to serve the whole mission of the organization. And that goes back to a bigger picture of how this book is pretty beneficial. If you're feeling stress as a leader around one of these topics that the book addresses, maybe you're skewed too far one direction or the other. Or if you're just feeling general stress and you're not quite sure how to address it as a leader, I've found this book to be a super interesting way to parse out the sort of different types of leadership or different aspects of leadership, I guess, that could be, skewed, or maybe where you need more education or you need to feel more balanced as a person, as a leader, in order to be more effective. Overall, I found this book to be a pretty quick and compelling read. There were interesting explanations. There were great summaries at the end of each chapter. If you didn't even want to read the chapter, you could read these sweet summaries with some examples and get the picture pretty quick. And I recommend it to folks who maybe are in leadership roles or even aspiring to leadership roles, or folks who are within an organization or within a group of folks that realize things feel stressful, or sometimes things feel not really effectively done by leaders you may have or by other folks within the organization. It can provide a lot of clarity. It can also be used as sort of a diagnostic tool to look at what might be going wrong within that organization or within that leadership structure. Overall, I recommend the book. There's a lot more depth and detail in there if you get into it reading. Don't just skip to the chapter summaries, or do what you want. Go crazy. Found it to be useful, beneficial, and also an interesting read. So this has been the Books Applied podcast by WSL Leadership Coaching. I'm Iggy Perillo. Thanks for listening.